Okay, warm welcome to the Clare Castle Archaeology Digs webinar. Thank you all for joining. I'm Jack Deal, I'm a new trustee of the park, and tonight's session will cover all of the recent digs at Clare and what's been found out and learned. A bit of housekeeping first. Please use the chat box to say hello and tell us where you're joining from so we can see where everyone's coming from. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the talks. There's quite a few people here tonight, so if we could put questions in the Q&A box, we'll cover those after the talk. Any technical problems, please use Q&A as well, and we'll try and sort those out as we go along. We are recording this lecture, so hopefully when it's finished, we can put it on YouTube. And there will be a survey at the end of the webinar. When you quit at the end, it will give you a survey to fill in. If you could complete that, that will help us to improve future webinars. Let's see where people are coming from. We've got Alex Saunders from Cotton in Cambridgeshire, Teresa Conway from Armagh, Chris Gregson from not far away in Woodbridge, Martin Watts from Stroud. I'm sure there are many more, but that's all I've got on my list at the moment. I know Caroline Hayward from Cambridgeshire, and Softcop just from Sudbury, so very close. So can I just quickly give you a bit of outline about Clare Castle Country Park? It's many of you will know. I mean, I'm sure many of you are from Clare, and but there will be some that are further away. It's a 36-acre park. It includes the remains of a 13th century stone castle keep that's on a 60-foot high motte. There's an inner and outer bailey, which are adjacent to each other, which is unusual. The inner bailey, particularly unusually, contains a former railway station. I believe it's the only one in the country where there's a railway station within the inner bailey of the castle. The rest of the park, away from the sort of castle and the station, includes footpaths through trees along the banks of the River Stour and along the old railway line. Our aim is to maintain the park for the benefit of the community and visitors, whilst improving educational and ecological opportunities. All of this is only really possible because of the support of visitors and volunteers like yourselves. So, we don't get any money from elsewhere. It's purely volunteer run. As you may well know, we've had a National Lottery Heritage Fund grant, which has changed things greatly in the last few years. It's allowed us to renovate the waiting room to become a visitor centre, which should open later in the summer. We've made education, training and volunteers centre around the back to invite people in to learn about the area. We've renovated the station platforms, which were pretty much falling into decay. And we've completely changed the old goods shed to be a multi-use space for hire. We've desilted the moat and improved the overgrown moss to make it look more like it would have looked originally. We've introduced a range of trails and accessibility trail, trim trail, sensory trail, heritage trails. We've put in a play train for children on one of the sidings. We are trying to introduce more activities in the park, storytelling. The forest school is there, pond dipping, etc. And generally speaking, we want to try and improve communication and engagement with everyone who uses the park. And obviously, we've done quite a series of archaeological digs, and clearly there's interesting archaeology there. So tonight we've got Joe Caruth, who's come to talk to you guys. Joe's got 37 years experience in archaeology, originally at Suffolk Council, then at Suffolk Archaeology, which eventually merged with Cotswold Archaeology. Joe worked on the Anglo-Saxon dig at RAF Lakenheath and found the Horse and Rider. Joe is Principal Post Excavation Manager, but enjoys extra roles as outreach leads, which allows her to do these community projects and field work. Joe is also chair of the Suffolk Institute of Archaeology and History, and of Rescue, the British Archaeological Trust, and a fellow of the Society of Antiquities. And she's a member of the Chartered Institute of Archaeologists. I think you're in safe hands. I hope I got all that right. So welcome, Joe, to do her presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, I was going to unmute, and my picture kept moving around over the screen, so I kept losing the little microphone sign. Okay, so I am now unmuted. I'm now going to share my screen with you. And Jack, you did get all of that right. It sounded a bit daunting, actually, even to me. So, right, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully, and I know that I'm sure there are people out there who will tell me if you can't see what you should be seeing, and I shall start my slideshow now. I'm sure Jack will give me the thumbs up that you can see my screen and you can't see anything else. Excellent.
Indeed.
Right, that's good. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk to you about today really is we're coming up to embarking on our final year of community excavation at Clare Castle Country Park, and I wanted to share with you some of what we've learned so far about the Norman Castle and the Saxon town that it succeeded, and what we're hoping to find out from this sort of final year of excavations. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to the history and the archaeology of the castle and the country park, and summarise what we already know from previous archaeological work, so that we can then discuss the results so far and the activities that we've got planned for the autumn. And then at the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask your own questions. This is the joy of Zoom, is that we can actually share these stories far and wide. So although I can see already from the chat box that a lot of you are local, there will be, or there certainly are, some people from further afield who won't know quite as much about Clare as we all do. So for those of you that aren't local, Clare is Suffolk's smallest town, and it lies on the north bank of the upper reaches of the River Stour. And this is the river that forms the county boundary between Suffolk and Essex. And Clare Castle, you can see the castle lies between the town and the river. So on the sort of just you can actually in this map you can see some of the water for the moats. The River Stour has been an important focus for settlement over thousands of years, and the Stour Valley is known for its remarkable prehistoric landscape. Which includes what you can see here. You can see ring ditches and concentric ring ditches, as well as pits and other linear and curvilinear monuments. And these date from the Neolithic, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age period. So anytime from about 3800 BC onwards. And this one here that you're looking at is an example of crop marks from the fields around Stoke by Nayland. But prehistoric finds have been made all across Clare itself. You see these sort of prehistoric monuments all the way up the Stour Valley. Oh, sorry, gone the wrong way. But if Clare is, how special Clare is really is partly by having a look at the range of monuments that we have here. And Clare Castle isn't the only nationally important monument in Clare. And on the north side of the town, there's Clare Camp. Now this is it's a double bank and ditch D-shaped enclosure, and it encloses around about 5 hectares. And over the centuries, it's gone through many interpretations and was originally thought to have been a Roman camp, as shown on this 19th century map. But it's now thought more likely that it's an Iron Age. When I was a girl, we always talked about it as the Clare Hill Fort, but many of us think that probably a hill fort has to be on a hill, so we now call it an Iron Age camp. But it was certainly in use in the medieval period as a manorial compound for the manor of Clare. Records suggest that prior to the Norman invasion, Clare was also a significant Saxon settlement, and there's one record that describes the Saxon lord as dwelling in a certain tower where the hospital now is. Now, towers are one of the key elements in the inventory of a late Saxon thane's burh. So there's a whole list of things that you have to have to qualify as a thane, and a tower is one of those things. So we think of Clare as having been a Saxon burh before it was a Norman castle. For those of you that don't know, a burh is a Saxon defended town, which they sort of originated in the west as Alfred first kept the Vikings at bay, and then they sort of moved eastwards and developed eastwards and they're found more widely as the English kings regained territory from the Danes in the 10th century. Clare Castle is one of 3 early Norman motte and bailey castles in Suffolk, And the other two, so Clare is here, and the other two are Eye there and Hawley in the middle there. And all three of these were constructed on lands forfeited from the Saxon landholders and awarded to loyal followers of William the Conqueror soon after the Norman conquest. We don't know exactly when Clare Castle was built, but it's probable that the Norman lord Richard Fitzgilbert was given the land for his loyalty to King William following the final quashing of various rebellions in 1075. And this is really when quite a lot of the lands were given out as thanks for support. And Domesday tells us that Richard had expanded what had been a pre-conquest market at Clare into something rather more significant, into a proper borough by 1086. So it's likely that the castle was built sometime between 1075 and 1086. But in the period, the first mention of the castle comes in 1090, and that's because in the period preceding the Norman invasion, when Clare was held by the Saxon lord Elfric, he founded a collegiate church dedicated to St. John in Clare in 1045, and there's a mention in 1090 that religious foundation was given to a monastery in France in 1090, and the thing that's mentioned about it is that it lies within the castle. So so we know that there's Clare Castle at 1090, and we know that this monastic site is within the castle, and that's quite an important piece of information to us, as you'll see as we go and start looking at the excavation results. The Motte and Bailey form of castle that we see at Clare is a familiar one with a tower on top of an earth mound. And Clare is actually one of these, the largest surviving of these early mottes at 20 metres or 60 feet tall, as Jack said. And it would originally have had a wooden fortification on the top, not a stone one. And as Jack said, that's the stone keep is a 13th century replacement. These early castles, these are called shell keeps, and these early castles, this is really much more of sort of a defensive and a lookout place rather than a residence. So not like the big castles at Orford where you know they've got all the rooms within it, but this was somewhere to retreat to in times of trouble, and much more importantly, somewhere to express your dominance over the conquered lands and provide oversight just in case that there might be trouble coming or unrest beneath you. So these were extreme expressions of power. Richard was given lands all across southeast England, and that he chose to make Clare his headquarters or his caput is another sign of what an important place Clare probably was before the Norman invasion. So after the castle was built, it continued to develop, and the earldom passed from father to son. However, with the death at Bannockburn in 1314 of Gilbert, who was the 10th Lord of Clare, the male line died out, and the Clare lands were split between three sisters, and Elizabeth de Burgh inherited Clare Castle. Now, I'm not going to really tell you anything about Elizabeth de Burgh because we've organised to have a talk of which her story will be one of the elements within that talk in August. So I also don't know very much about her, so it's another good reason not to say too much. But what we do know is that when she was here, she made it. It was her primary residence, and it's really from the time of her occupancy that we know the most about the castle. And she undertook a programme of improvement, and there's lots and lots of documents that describe the buildings and the gardens and the activities, household expenses, and generally gives us this fantastic picture of day-to-day life in the 14th century. So from 1317 until her death in 1360, Clare was the principal home of one of the wealthiest noble women in the country. She was a niece of Edward II, and both the castle and the town were extensively rebuilt during her time in residence. There have been this sketch map of Clare was drawn up in the early 20th century, suggesting what the castle might have looked like in the 14th century, and it's really taken from all the accounts and inventories from the period in which Elizabeth de Burgh was living at Clare in the 14th century, and it includes references that reveal that she had an exceptional private garden or herba within the castle precinct, which sounds, well, as you know, Clare Country Park is already a really beautiful place, and you can imagine that it was, that it would have been very lovely during the time that she was there. So after Elizabeth de Burgh's death, the castle never really regained that status that it had had during her occupancy, but it was sporadically occupied into the 15th century, and it was occupied by Cecily Neville in the 15th century, and she was the mother of Edward IV, and he visited here more than once. And it's now thought that Cecily Neville is probably the person who lost this fantastic gold cross, the Clare Cross, that was found during railway construction in the 19th century. And this really is sort of marks the end of the heyday, or the end of the proper occupancy of Clare Castle. And from the 16th century, it fell into disrepair. It's pretty hard now to work out the exact layout, or it certainly was up until the point when when this latest lottery grant was given. But it was pretty hard to work out the exact layout of Clare Castle on the ground because of that railway line that runs right the way through it, which you can see. Hopefully, you can see my cursor, and this is where the railway line ran through. So this is the old goods shed here, and these are the station buildings here. And this picture's taken from the Motte. Now, as Jack said, this is the only castle in the country with a railway running through it. I think probably we can say that's quite a good thing. When you look at how close this line is to the castle Motte, it's pretty shocking, really. But hey ho, that's where we are. There was just before the railway went through, there was an article in the proceedings of the Suffolk Institute of Archaeology and History, and this included this representation of the two bailies of Clare Castle very, very, very shortly before the railway went through. So the outer bailey here and the inner bailey here attached to the Motte, and this is quite an elaborate entrance between the two bailies. And there still do survive masonry walls on the banks of the earthworks of the inner bailey, not much sign on the outer bailey. And this is where the railway line runs through, and the entrance looks to have been in roughly where Station Road comes in now, so coming in through here and down, and this is sort of roughly.
Sorry, where your cursor isn't actually showing up on the screen. I don't think it's
okay, sorry. Is it showing up now?
Hi.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So this is where this is where Station Road comes in. So Station Road running in down here and through. This is the entrance between the two bailies with the station in here. And this is just showing where this shows you on the plan where the station went. But it's as well as the gold cross found during the construction of the railway, there are other evidence of Clare Castle that came as a result of railway works. So that for example, in 1951, there were human remains were found when they were constructing a weighbridge where the Blue Star is. And then in 2000, further human remains were recovered or were identified when there was a pit being dug to put in the Millennium Beacon. So as well as the gold cross, we now have had this evidence by the turn of the 21st century. We had this evidence for burials within there as well. But the castle had become when the station closed in 1967 as part of the beaching cuts, the whole area came into quite a degree of neglect. And certainly I remember as a child, you were barely aware of there being a Castle Motte, and you certainly couldn't get onto it in the 70s. And that's about the time it was pretty much as a result of that, I think, that the country park got taken over and made into a country park because it was in such a sorry state. But really, apart from this, very little was known about the archaeology of the castle until the first of two HLF projects, the Managing the Masterpiece project, which included some trial trenching in the inner bailey in 2013. And this was designed really to establish how much damage how much damage the railway had actually done to the medieval archaeology. And so because the results of that, they were surprisingly good, and they identified, and you can see these two little green trenches here. If you can see in these trenches, these were the trenches that were dug in 2013, and they found that the archaeology was surprisingly well preserved underneath the railway line, and found evidence of medieval buildings and more burials. So now we've got burials not only where we'd had them originally, but also in this area here. So that's burials across quite an extensive part of that area. But it was unclear whether this was really a single cemetery, or in fact we were looking at burials that had been disturbed by railway activity and other, and other digging in there. So as a result of those trial excavations, when the HLF bid was successful, there was a 3-year plan for excavations within the 2 baileys of Clare Castle was proposed. And this is what I'm going to just show you the results of. So we started off in year 1 in the outer bailey, which are these trenches that you can see up here. And we knew very little about the outer bailey from the conjectural evidence of that 14th century plan. There were some buildings on it, but there was no certainty that they were based on any evidence at all, other than what was conjectured from the written descriptions. But it was suggested that this area had housed the stables and the kennels, the houses for the huntsmen. So that was really what we were looking for in here. But we had no idea how damaged the archaeology would be here. The site was pretty flat, and we didn't actually, in all honesty, we didn't have a lot of hope for it. But in fact, when we removed topsoil from the machine across the 4 trenches, this immediately revealed substantial masonry remains within 20 centimetres of the existing surface, and structural remains in both the central and the northern part of the site, the most significant of which was this building. And you can see what you're looking at here. This is the corner of a building in this direction, and this close-up of the walls. And you can see it's masonry walls of flint. What's noticeable is that the corner here is really quite ragged, and there are places where the wall is missing, and again the ends are really ragged. And we think this may be that, in fact, this building originally had stone coins, and that they've been robbed out and salvaged for use elsewhere, and that possibly these gaps that we see here might have been doorways that again could have had stone coins that were robbed out. There was also plaster on the inside of the wall here, so it looks potentially at some sort of domestic structure, but we're not really sure what. But it was there had been a geophysical survey in 2003, and this building hadn't shown up on that survey. So we took the opportunity to do a bit of training with some of our volunteers, and to bring out our own geophysicist to re-survey the area and see if we could find the rest of the wall, because all we had was this corner here and the footings here. And in fact, what you can see from the geophysical, obviously unfortunately we couldn't do this bit here because this is where our spoil heaps were, so we had to go slightly beyond it. But you can see in this survey the wall coming out there and the wall going down there, and in fact it looks like another wall probably coming off in that direction there. So what we've ended up with is a large building about 19 meters by 9 meters, and we initially thought possibly a barn or kennels, but the evidence from the internal plaster suggests perhaps a domestic dwelling, or a hall maybe. We don't really know, but it's certainly it's exciting to have found a building of that scale, and it does back up some of that documentary evidence. We also found 2 ovens. Now these were initially we identified these by huge masses of dumps of daub and mortar. And here, on this one here, you can see where the daub had been pressed into the wattles of the structure of the oven. Now we had this big area here, and we originally thought we actually had the oven, but once we cleared it out, we realized that what we actually got was a very large stoke pit, and we hadn't got any of the certainly any in situ remains of the actual oven structure. And it's probable that when it went out of use, it was sort of collapsed, and all the superstructure of the domed, what would have been a very large domed fired clay structure, was all just pushed into the stoke pit. In fact, we thought it might be a bit of an odd oven, because we thought that these the surfaces of these looked flat, and normally for ovens you would expect the outer surface of the daub to have been curved. But of course, we realized what it is it's just a really huge oven, and therefore the curve is very, very slight, and so it doesn't really show on these smaller pieces. And it's interesting, when we look at Lady Elizabeth de Burgh's accounts, we can see that they were using hundreds of loaves of bread a day. So maybe this is one of those bread ovens for feeding the castle. And in fact, we took environmental samples from the top of the ash and the soil layers within the stoke pit, and what do you know, we got cereal grains from white bread wheat, and this produces the high quality white flour that was valued by the rich and powerful. So perfect really for a bread oven within a castle, especially with someone as wealthy as Lady Elizabeth in residence. We also found an extensive spread of flints, and this is where you can really see how close to the surface the archaeology was found. And this covered a very large area, and the flints were only a single flint thick, and the flints were very close together, but the surface was a little bit rough. There were some depressions in it, as if it might have been worn, or even cart ruts or something like that. But we also found a lot of rubble in the second year, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And it is just possible that instead of being a complete surface, some or all of this is actually demolition debris that's been spread very, very thin in order to create a level surface. So that's not a question. At the time, we thought we understood what this was, and now we're not quite so sure. So that remains another question to ponder over for the Outer Bailey. And then finally, our fourth trench, we dug up in the southern end of the Outer Bailey, very close to the existing banks. And we were attracted to it because the 2003 geophysical survey had suggested that there might be a bank across here. And when we looked at it in a topographic survey, we could also see the ground rising up in this area. So we were interested to have a look at that. And what we found here was a very large ditch. And indeed, there was a bank on its southern edge. And we also found, this is where we got almost all of the finds from the Outer Bailey. So it looks as if this may have been where they were either during the occupation, they were dumping all their rubbish, or possibly that it was actually cleared out to this area at some point towards the end of the main use of the Outer Bailey. But in looking at where this is and how it fits in, this is part of the earthwork that goes round the Outer Bailey, and it comes round here. And looking where this is, it does look as if at some point these earthworks have been remodelled, and that's certainly an interesting thing to think about. One of the things that we've been considering, as Jack said, this double bailey is quite an unusual layout for a castle, and it has always been wondered whether one of these baileys might actually have been much earlier, possibly another Iron Age earthwork, or perhaps earthworks associated with the Saxon town. So evidence of any of it being remodelled is potentially quite important. The finds that we picked out from that we collected from the Outer Bailey were predominantly 4th to 12th to 14th century, and they were consistent with the heyday of the castle, and a lot of pottery, and most interestingly, there were other finds as well, I'll show you in a minute, but these were the most exciting finds for me anyway, I thought, were these enigmatic objects. Now, we spent the entire excavation, we spent wondering what these could be, and we turned them upside down and we wondered, could they be rushlight holders for, you know, we imagined having your rushlights as you're going around the castle. But in fact, when we sent them off to be looked at by an expert, they came back that this is actually a specialized military arrowhead in use in the 13th and 14th centuries. And we found quite a lot of these. We found about 7 of them, and they were all in that area of that ditch and bank. Now, I did say, of course, that could be that that's a midden deposit and everything's been just cleared off into that area. But I have to say, I rather fancy the idea of the knights of the castle using the Outer Bailey to practice their arrow shooting, so and their archery. So I rather prefer that as an explanation, but of course it could just be that they're in the middens. But nevertheless, it is a sign that we've got military equipment within the bailey of this medieval castle. We also had a lot of horseshoes amongst the finds in the Outer Bailey, which fits again with this documentary evidence that this might have been the area of the stables and the kennels. And the horseshoes again were sort of quite small horseshoes, characteristic of that 12th to 14th century, and a lot of horseshoe nails. We also found some evidence of the high status of the area. There were only a few household items, but we did have this, but of the rather fancier things, we had this delicate gold stirrup ring that's 11th or 12th century date here. But also we had some evidence that people were concerned to lock things up. So we've got this iron key here, and also this really nice little silver casket key. This is a sort of a padlock key here, and this is a little casket key here, suspended from a wire loop. And again, the date sort of 11th to 12th century for these. So again, contemporary with the use of the castle and indicators of the status of it, and that people had things that they wanted to secure and to lock away. We didn't really get below the medieval archaeology. There was so much more than we had expected to find that we ended up really working in that. But we did put a couple of slots through some of the structural material, and we found that there is still archaeology underneath that. And we did get some late Saxon Thetford ware, so that's sort of 10th to 11th century pottery from out of the Outer Bailey. Obviously some of it in the medieval layers, but we also found some really some earlier Saxon objects, such as this 7th century bone pin at the bottom here and a 6th century penannular brooch. But also we found, and it was found by hand, not by a metal detectorist, which was very satisfying for the volunteer who found it. And this is a very rare late Saxon coin of Kernwulf, minted from 796 to 805, and from the Canterbury Mint of Ethelmod. So a really exciting find, and another indicator that there certainly was Saxon occupation in this area before the castle. As well as the planned archaeology that we're doing, there was also archaeological monitoring carried out while some of the construction works were going on and the improvement works to the various facilities that Jack has described. And this was monitored for archaeology as it happened. So looking at the sort of thing we do on a lot of construction sites, and looking in the trenches and looking in various soakaways and things like that were put in. And as we discussed earlier, when the railway went in, it flattened some of the earthworks. You can see this great chunk. There was actually a bank that came off here, and this great chunk here was completely lost to the railway running through. But fortunately, looking in the trenches from during the new construction works and the improvement works, we actually found evidence of all this material spread out all across this area. And this is what you can see, the clay from the motte in this upper in the upper layers of this section here, and then underneath this dark soil that you can see in there, that's the moat, and that's the infilled moat. So we could see that although it's now infilled, all of this was still there, and we could plot its location and with some accuracy. So that was very satisfying. And this is that flattened rampart. This is the bit that comes off the motte on the south side of the motte. And again, you can see again the clay from that as it's been dispersed in the immediate area, and again more moat material underneath there. And this is on the other side of that rampart. So we're seeing evidence of the moat either side of that rampart. So in 2019, we then moved into the inner bailey, and we arranged to put 5 trenches into here. We knew that the medieval archaeology was going to survive, at least on this side, largely intact. So we focused most of our trenches into this area. And the aim of these was really to look at the, to see if we could find some more burials, and really to examine the medieval archaeology that we hope to find. And in here, we didn't know what might be in here, but we were quite close to that Millennium beacon, and we wanted to see whether we might get any burials in there. We then also opted to put a trench in near the entrance to here, between the 2 baileys, and have a look. There was some suggestion of that there might have been a kitchen or something like that in this area. It's one of the slightly better located building locations from the written records. And then trench 5 here we put in because the tithe map shows a pond through here, and wanted to have a little bit more of a look at that, and how big it was, and if we could get some dating from it potentially. And in fact, as that trench 5, this one here, at this end, it actually proved rather rewarding, because it also solved another mystery. There was we'd noticed this big gash out of the side of the motte in this area. And when we put the trench in, we found that actually on top of some of the railway debris, in fact, there was a whole load more of this blue and yellow clay, which is obviously again motte material that's been redeposited. And we were able to show that whatever that gash was, whether it's a landslip or actually some sort of damage to do with the railway, it had happened very late on in the 19th or the 20th century. So it wasn't something to do with medieval activity. And in fact, that gash has now been infilled as part of the and it's been made good as part of the recent works. So we went into trenches 6, 7, and 8. Or these are the trenches on the southern side of the motte, where we were really hoping that we would get a lot of medieval archaeology surviving underneath the railway works. And sure enough, we did. And in fact, you can see really well in this section, this is all sort of various bits of railway debris, and there's some railway debris in these upper layers, and this layer of quite hard mortuary sand at the base of it. And then the brown soil that you can see underneath it, that's the medieval occupation material. And we've got really, in this area, we've got really good preservation of medieval soil layers, despite the fact that they drove a railway through it. So we started, this is trench 6, and we started digging this. And what we found is at the southern end of the trench, here, we found a significant spread of building debris, and all in this southern end of it. But in fact, it overlay some cut features and ditches and pits that we'd found in this upper area. Now, it took us a little while to realise it, but in fact, one of the reasons we had the building debris surviving particularly well at this end is because, in fact, the entire ground was sloping from the earthworks, which are run along this end, the Lady Walk earthworks along here, right the way down to the River Ster. And of course, what it meant was, although this was now flat because of the railway, and we'd machined it flat because of the railway, in fact, the natural ground levels were sloping, and we've got a greater degree of truncation of medieval deposits here. Medieval deposits here than we had down in this end here, which is where we've really got very, very well preserved stratigraphy. Now, that really well preserved stratigraphy, including both demolition debris from the buildings, and as we were at the end of 2019, just beginning to discover that looked like we've got in situ building material as well. This means that we didn't actually get through. We didn't get through all of this in 2019, and this is a top priority for the upcoming season of works. Is to look into this in a bit more detail, get rid of or excavate off the upper layers and actually find those buildings that are underneath there. And maybe, again, probably the best possibility we've got of finding more of actual potentially Saxon buildings and Saxon settlements. We did find in the cut features, we did find this feature here, which appears to be an Anglo-Saxon ditch, Anglo-Saxon pit. The ditches are medieval, but quite early, with sort of 11th to 12th century pottery coming out of them. Whereas this one here, we actually got 10th to 11th century pottery out of it, and it was cut away, cut through by the ditches. So this is the earliest stratigraphic feature that we found so far, and gives us great hope for that we might get some of the Saxon evidence as well. And then in trenches 7 and 8, all we found were burials. It was quite noticeable that the soil above them was, and when we started stripping the site, it was very different from the area where we'd got the building debris, and it was quite a homogeneous brown soil. And of course, the reason for that is that it's all graves, and it's all the backfill of a cemetery. The only thing we found that wasn't was this rather scrappy base of a flint and mortar wall. It was only 1 or 2 flints thick, and we couldn't see any facing on either side to indicate which was an inside or an outside. But as you can see, it was actually sat on top of all the grave fill. So I think this is probably quite a bit later. It could still be medieval, but certainly significantly later than the burial ground. So the summary, just to recap really on what we got on the southern side of the Inner Bailey. So this is where we've got the archaeological features in Trench 6. So this is that ditch, the north-south ditch that we had here, and this is the Anglo-Saxon pit in here, and this is the building debris and the starting to get the evidence for actual buildings that we were just starting to get at the end of the 2019 season. And what we've also got here, these are burials that were found in 2013. So we know that we've got burials up to this point here. They appear to be against that ditch there, and we didn't get burials beyond this ditch here. Now, that may or may not be a coincidence. That's something else for us to investigate in this upcoming season. And then we also found the burials that we got in trenches 7 and 8, and you can see that they're very well aligned. They're in rows. They're very closely spaced, and this is really a well-ordered cemetery. So trench 9, we dug up, which is the one we dug up by the entrance, where we hoped we might find evidence of a kitchen, and in fact we did find building evidence in here. That we found an oven, the base of an oven. It was badly truncated and highly compacted from railway activity, and we also, there's actually under here, there are the fragments, the very base of a flint wall as well. So it does look as if there was a building in this area. And on top of that, when we were digging it, we found lots and lots of animal bone, which it still needs to be analysed, but we're really hopeful that this is going to give us some really good evidence that this was that this actually was the kitchen area, and that we get lots of butchery and evidence that this is all kitchen waste. But we also, as well as that, we also found burials under all of this in this trench as well. So that's burials right up to the entrance between the two Baileys. So trench 5. This is what trench 5 was dug to investigate. This possible moat that was on the whether it's a pond or a moat that was on the tithe map. And we were hoping that if we could have a look at that and maybe get right down to some early ground levels either side of it, it might give us a clue as to the origins of the castle and whether there was any evidence that it was built on some earlier earthwork. But in fact, what we found is we found evidence of the ground again was badly truncated. And if you think what I was saying about the southern side, that we've got the ground sloping, that makes sense that on this northern side of the Inner Bailey, the ground has been very badly truncated by the railway line. But what we did find was more burials, and these had been cut away by the archaeological features from which we were getting medieval pottery. So again, we were getting this evidence of a burial ground that appeared to be the very earliest features across the site. So they're under all the medieval archaeology. And this just shows you this, this is where the moat was. And it does mean that we've got, that we now know that we've got burials all the way across that area. Now, we don't yet quite understand what we were looking at in that trench 5, because we've got this sharp edge here, and we've got, we know that it's coming across around about here, so it's coming up from these, from this area, but we don't know whether we're looking at a moat coming around like this, or whether we're looking at these ditches that we found in here, and we found this one here, and these ones that were found during the monitoring of this pipe trench here. So we know that we've got north-south, or roughly north-south aligned ditches running here, and we know that we've got this edge for the moat here. So is it this infilled moat? Is it these ditches running through? And that means that's given us another question that we want to address in this upcoming season. So in the end, we found burials in every trench, and because we didn't want to lift the remains, we got the osteoarchaeologist out on site to look at them in situ, and she has been able to tell us something about these, about the people who are buried there. And we've got 6 adult males, with 3 adult females and 1 child about 11 to 12 years, and the other bones from previous work. So the bones that came up from under the Weybridge, and the remains found in 2000, and the 2000 and the ones from the excavations in 2013 have also identified a mix of adult males, females, and juveniles. So it looks like we're looking at a mixed communal cemetery. We had originally thought we might have something associated with that late Saxon monastic site. If you recall, there's a late Saxon monastic site within the castle grounds, and we had wondered that we might have remains from that. But this is clearly not that. There were only about 6 monks there, and we've got vastly more burials than that. And as I say, it looks like we've got a community group. And as it happens, this burial here is really quite interesting. You can see this is a female, and she's got stones around the head. Now, this is something that is quite often seen. It's very well recorded in a churchyard in Raunds. And the idea, it's thought that the idea of this is to tip the head up and support the head, so that when the soil is put on, the soil isn't thrown directly onto the face. And in fact, it's a way of respecting the burial. And this is a particularly interesting individual, because she's got Asiatic features. So there's a possibility, quite a wide nose and these wide bands, a wide sort of forehead here. And it's just possible that this may be an immigrant from other parts of the world. We've got enough bone. We've got a little bit of her bone that was up in the loose, so we could potentially in the future do some isotope analysis on that to find out her origins, and see if we have got somebody coming from perhaps, you know, the other side of the world into Clare. And the finds from the second season, they were quite, in some ways, they were quite similar to that from the first season. Again, a lot of 12th to 14th century pottery, but we did have quite a larger assemblage of late Saxon and early medieval, so St Neots ware, Thetford ware pottery, which could be anywhere from the 10th to the 12th century, and a lot of which were the sort of 11th to 12th century forms. But it has given us again that evidence of late Saxon activity within the immediate area. But we also found some other really fantastic Anglo-Saxon finds. So this piece of glass, which is a piece of Middle Saxon vessel glass with you can see these white trails on here. This is very similar to vessel glass recovered from the Middle Saxon settlement at Brandon on the River Ouse in the north of the county. And we've also got this piece of an Anglo-Saxon bone comb, but actually one of the most, for me anyway, one of the most satisfying finds. In fact, I'm not sure it's shown that well on this image, maybe it's showing better for you, but this was a halfpenny of William I. So this is a halfpenny that dates to the very period when the castle was being built. And that for me, it just seems one of the most amazing finds, really. Just a little halfpenny, but there right at the beginning of the story. Other finds, more horseshoes. There's very little, again, not much in the way of household items or evidence of craft working. Again, some quite fancy things. This is, I think this is, this is a pyramidal belt mount, and this is a gilded copper alloy spur buckle here. And there was just this one piece of antler here, which could have been for antler working, a little lead spindle whirl. But actually, most of the objects weren't so much about the day-to-day life of ordinary people. So just to recap on what have we learned and what do we still want to know? We've identified in the Outer Bailey something that fits with a lot of the documentary evidence, a large building here, possibly a stable, but possibly this was the housing for the huntsman, possibly a wall coming off it here. Some evidence of remodeling of the earthworks at this southern end here, a big area of flint spread, possibly a deliberate surface. It seems to possibly sort of wrap round the edge of this building when you look at the early geophysics survey as well, and a couple of ovens, one there and one there. Now, what's really interesting about these ovens when overlaid onto the 2003 geophysical survey is that both of them are in places where they had suggested they might be. And what this shows us, okay, so there's that another really big oven there, and another one there, another one here, another one here. So it does look as if the Outer Bailey was probably the area of the majority of the kitchens and the ovens and the sort of the lower status part of the castle. And then on the Inner Bailey, the most stunning find is that we have a massive cemetery. There's a radiocarbon date from one of the graves that was dug up in the Weybridge, which is over the Weybridge graves over here, dated to the late 10th to the early 11th century. So it looks as if we've got, I mean, it's only one burial, obviously, but the pottery that we're getting out suggests 10th and 11th century activity here. So this is potentially the cemetery for the Anglo-Saxon town. It's clearly a communal cemetery, and it appears to predate the castle. Now, if the area, this is sort of a rough area, just joining up where we've got the extent of the graves. So here and graves in here. That area alone could house between 500 and 1,000 burials, but we don't know here. We don't know if we've got graves in here. It could be much bigger than that, and it raises some really interesting question about the cemetery. Okay, so we're fairly confident that this cemetery was here before the Norman conquest. What we don't know is whether, when it went out of use, did they carry on when they built the castle? Did they carry on burying in this cemetery? Has this got some of the early castle occupants in it, or is the placement of this castle on the, presumably the town is nearby. There was some test pitting evidence suggested that the heart of the Saxon town might have been in the centre of the current town, which is only a couple of hundred yards, a couple of hundred meters from where we are here. And was the placement of this castle on this town, is this that the ultimate conquest is to place your castle on the town and the cemetery? We don't know. I mean, it's really fascinating questions that come out of this. And this is really where we're going to sort of focus in the upcoming season. So we've got the dates set. The 20th of September is when we start to dig again, and we'll be going on until the 8th of October. And you'll be welcome to come and visit and have a look and see how things are getting on. And our main aims are, we're going to complete Trench 6. We want to get down, we want to find those medieval buildings and get down to see what's underneath it. We want to open a new area near Trench 5, because we really need to understand what's happening with those ditches and what function they're serving, whether they're in fact Anglo-Saxon ditches, or are they associated with an early part of the castle. If we know the ground is sloping down to the river, are they actually drainage ditches taking water away from the higher parts of the Inner Bailey? there was an evaluation trench dug in the woods that we hoped to open in 2019 and we didn't, but it had some really good evidence of probably a 14th or 15th century chapel with some really nice tiles and window glass, and we'd really like to get that. Wasn't finished in 2013, and we'd really like to get in and do that. And we also want to try and determine the relationship between the cemetery and the earthworks in some way or another. It's a tricky thing to do, especially as obviously most of the earthworks are scheduled and they've been damaged enough really without us going in there as well. But it would make, if we knew that that cemetery ran under the earthworks, we would then have an even stronger understanding of the relationship between the castle and the cemetery and the likelihood that it went on in use. So that's something still to kind of work out exactly how we're going to address that particular aim. So this is the trenches that I'm proposing at the moment. This is the trench in the woods that we're hoping to do. This is an extension for this trench 5, so we can pick up this ditch coming through, see how it relates to that moat running through there. And then we're also, hopefully you can remember some of what I've said, and I was saying how the soil was different in the cemetery area, and that might be a way to identify the extent of the cemetery. And so what we're planning to do is we want to run a trench out from trench 6 up to where we know we've got burials here, and see if we can find a formal boundary to the cemetery, which even if we couldn't find it as a wall, we might be able to identify it in a change in the soil from over the cemetery to over the demolition rubble. So that's our plans for the upcoming season. I mean, I'm sure you can see that we're going to get nowhere near answering all the questions of Clare Castle. I really, really wanted to completely dig one of those ovens in the Outer Bailey and see how big those bread ovens actually were, but I just don't think we're going to have time. So that'll have to be something for another grant award in the future. So there's going to be an open day on Sunday the 3rd of October. I hope you'll all come and visit. I'm sure that some of the people who are listening are actually going to be in the digging crew as well. But there'll be exhibitions, and you'll be able to see the finds, and we'll be finds washing all the time that we're digging. So anytime you're wandering through the country park, drop in, have a look, see what finds are coming up, have a chat to the people who are doing the work. And obviously, something like this just can't happen without the support of a huge number of people. And so thanks are due to the trustees of the country park, the Heritage Lottery Fund, who of course provided the money, Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, who've been really supportive, and Cotswold Archaeology staff, many of whom have given time for free, and Natalie Tarling of the country park, and Caroline Adams, who've organised these webinars and are helping organise a lot of the event. But of course, the most important thing, the volunteers and the visitors. None of this could happen without you. None of it could be dug without the volunteers, and there'd be no point in doing it without the visitors. So we really want to see you come down, and especially if you happen to be particularly artistic and you want to come and sit and paint us. This painting here, done by Carol Goodchild in the first season, fantastic memento of community excavations, and we'll be very happy to have another one for the final season. And that's me done, and I will stop share and take any questions.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions I'll read out. So Kevin Parry asks, regarding the Outer Bailey ditch and the military specialist arrows and horseshoes, was there any evidence of a furnace or smithy found in the area?
Not in the bit that we saw, but you saw all those ovens on that I was pointing out on that geophysical survey. Some of those really are quite big, and any one of those could have been could turn out to be something like that. I mean, given that we now know that the Outer Bailey has got all this well-preserved archaeology in it, it's a shame we can't just strip it all, really. But there you go.
Yeah, cool.
So we have to be a bit careful.
Well, I mean, we could be there for a long time, couldn't we?
Well, that would be all right, wouldn't
it? Yeah. Another question from Helen Kirkuk. Could you say something about the alignment of the bodies in the graves? They don't appear to be all lying in the same direction.
They were mostly lying in the same direction. They're all east-west aligned. They're Christian burials. It was interesting. Trench 7 you could see the burials were very, very clearly arranged, very closely placed, very well aligned. In fact, we think they probably aligned with the burials that we found over in the moat trench. But in Trench 8, there was a lot more evidence of intercutting. So many more of the burials have been cut into other burials. So some of what we were looking at there were actually disarticulated remains that had been disturbed by later graves having been dug through.
A question from Abby related to the same thing. I know we have a skeleton of a woman with Asiatic features. Any insight into the origins of other skeletons? I assume they were more likely to be more local, but
we couldn't. There was nothing striking about the ones that we excavated. They did do isotopes. One of the, I think it was Bristol University, did isotope analysis on the Weybridge skeleton, and he came out as local, probably local. So isotope analysis is where you look at the chemical makeup of the teeth and the bones, and you can say something either about the water that was the chemical makeup of the water that was being drunk, which sort of impregnates the teeth, or you can say something sometimes about diet from various chemicals in the bones of people. And they did that they looked at the origins of the Weybridge man, and he came out as local.
Great. Can I ask a question quickly?
Yeah.
I'm still interested in this two Baileys thing, which surprised me that there are two Baileys. The tithe map you showed earlier referred to the inner Bailey as the old Bailey. Is that just what it says on a map, or is that significant? Is that likely to be the older of the two?
I don't think we know. I don't know why the tithe map describes it as the old Bailey. Something that they thought at the time it might be. We don't really know which one. I mean, I think actually more recently we had thought possibly the outer Bailey was the older one, right, because the inner Bailey most definitely relates to the castle, because it comes off the castle from both sides, whereas it's the outer Bailey that's the slightly odd one in that slightly odd position.
Another one hot off the press. Jane Crone says, do we know of any other castles with evidence of Anglo-Saxon burials underneath?
There are some. I'm afraid that this is where I show my ignorance. I couldn't tell you which ones there are, but I do happen to know that there are others, and I know that there's somebody associated with the Castles Trust who's actually doing some research at the moment into this, and I'm hoping that perhaps we'll be able to get him to come down and have a look at Clare. So I think, although it's not something that I can give you any information about now, I think it is something that we are going to learn more about over the next year, sort of 18 months.
I mean, I'd assume that the location of the castle was simply because of where the river was, and defences using that. But you think it might be a sign of status to put the castle on who you conquered? Well,
it's I mean, when you don't know anything about what's there, then yes, it looks like that's a great place for a castle down, and you can see how you've got the river and the defence and all that sort of thing. When you start to see what's there, I mean, first of all, the fact that there was this monastic site within the castle, you've immediately got that first little bit of evidence of earlier activity within the immediate area. And then when you start to find other things, and then when you start to find this massive cemetery, you start to think, well, they would have known about that cemetery. That cemetery presumably was in use right up until the conquest. So you start to get this sense of the placement of this castle. It's not just about having a really good strategic position. It's saying something a hell of a lot more to the people of the area, and especially when you think if it was given to Richard in 1075 as a reward for his help suppressing rebellions, he probably wants to make it clear to people, I'm here because I suppressed rebellions, don't even think about it. And there's all that sort of thing going on in the language of where you put these monuments.
Much less peaceful times than now.
Yes, I think so. Although, as with all these things, it's most people probably weren't involved in fighting. It's the role of a civilian in battle before the 20th century really was pretty minimal, and generally civilians, a lot of the time, civilians were pretty much out of it. It's just the soldiers who were actually, I mean, you were oppressed and you had to do what you were told, but probably most of the fighting would be done by dedicated soldiers and wouldn't have involved the ordinary people of the town.
Two more questions come in. First one's from Anonymous, so we'll never know. Will there be opportunities for less experienced volunteers to assist in the digging, or is that reserved for more qualified people?
It's not reserved for more qualified people. I'm hoping that she won't mind. I'm going to ask Caroline to unmute. Caroline is our outreach officer, and she's actually handling the applications for to take part in the digging. So, Kaz, can you unmute and give people some guidance as to what they can do? Do you mind? Sorry.
That's fine. Evening, everybody. It's very nice to kind of for all of you to come and listen to our webinar this evening. Just bear with me.
Sorry,
apologies. I had my other screen open at the time, so that I could just see what it looked like from an attendee's point of view. I have been actually sending out information about how you can get involved with volunteering at Clare Castle. The applications are actually still open until the 30th of July, so I can still send out information regarding that. So, but by all means, it's for people who may not have any experience. We've got some people who've obviously been digging at Clare Castle before and other excavations as well. So I'm going to put a little note in a moment into the chat box to everybody with my email address, and if you'd like to get in contact with me, it's caroline.adams@cotswoldarchaeology.co.uk, but I'll put that in the chat box for you. So please do get in touch if you'd like to be involved.
Great. So Christopher Young asks, there are Anglo-Saxon burials at Caruth Castle on the Isle of Wight. I think I pronounced that right. But they're 6th century, not Saxon. Thought the earliest period of settlement is probably late Saxon Burr.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I did know that there were some other things, but I didn't realise that Carisbrooke was one that I'd heard of, but I didn't realise that those burials were actually so much earlier. Of course, we don't know when ours might have started, but they certainly look to be. They don't look to be that early.
Okay, that's all the questions we have. Any questions we should have asked you?
No.
Oh, we go. We've got another one now.
You probably have more than enough of listening to me, I should think. So I do tend to go on a bit. Sorry.
So one final question from Jeff Lunn. Could the motte be built over an IA mound on the Saxon cemetery? And is the Saxon cemetery honouring the ancient dead in that location?
Absolutely, it could be. Those of you that are local will know that Thetford Castle is built on an Iron Age fort. Absolutely, it could. That's one of the possibilities. If we've got earlier earthworks, is not that it's the Saxon Burr, but that it's an Iron Age earthwork. So yes, certainly it could be. But we haven't found, as yet, we haven't found any evidence of that. The earlier evidence we're getting is all sort of the earliest is mostly the 6th century. There is a little, we've got the odd Iron Age item come up, but really what we're seeing looks like it's mostly going to be actually 9th, 10th, 11th century, just a little bit earlier.
Okay, well, that's been brilliant. Been really, really informative. I've learned a lot, certainly. So thank you everyone for coming. Obviously, there's plenty of opportunities to come to Clare Castle and engage and volunteer as you want. Do come and see the digs. There's going to be a lot to see, I think, over those few weeks. And as you leave the webinar, you'll be asked to do a survey. Please do that. That helps us improve. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I look forward to seeing you from the 20th of September. Put the date in your diary. Yeah,
there's been a last-minute question about the webinar being available online. I believe it will be on the Cotswold Archaeology website, won't it?
Hi, I'll just jump in there and just say that yes, this webinar has been recorded for everybody this evening. All our webinars are recorded. So we'll obviously just need to do some editing, and hopefully it'll be available for everybody in about 1 or 2 weeks' time. And we'll send out the link on social media and on our website, but I'd also be mailing it out to everybody who I sent this to, information to about the webinar via the emailing list.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that's all. Goodbye. See you at the dig, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.